Okay, other... Oh, thanks. Thank you. Yes.
I saw you last night, so I got you're the constitutional expert.
Well, I do my best.
Explain. To me, there's always been a deep notion there's a conflict between the 10th and the 14th Amendment. Since you're the expert, would you explain this to me?
Okay, the 14th Amendment is probably one of the most controversial parts of the Constitution. It may be the most controversial of the amendments, now that I think about it. Well, no. The 16th is pretty controversial, and the 17th is sort of controversial, but the 14th Amendment has a number of provisions that are not really relevant to us today, like about the Confederate debt. I mean, nobody's going around expecting that to be honored today, so, and that, or excluding Confederates from office. I mean, that, it's only really the first part that's relevant to us. And so it's important just to try to figure out what was intended by this. Now, from my perspective, I'm not an expert on the 14th Amendment. There are people who are, and you could easily devote a career to this. But from my perspective, it was a guy named Raoul Berger, B-E-R-G-E-R, who was a professor at Harvard, who in spite of that had a lot of useful things to say, who wrote a huge book called Government by Judiciary, and then a much shorter book, which basically says the same thing, and you can read it much more quickly, called the 10th Amendment and the Bill, the 14th Amendment and the Bill of Rights. And as far as I'm concerned, he had this correct. His argument was, we need to look at what was the intent of the 14th Amendment, because it has phrases in there that are extremely open-ended. I mean, they're almost as open-ended as general welfare and necessary and proper. It's like a microcosm of the whole Constitution in that these phrases had a definite meaning at the time, but then with the passage of time, well, now they just encompass everything. So what was meant by this? Well, no one is to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, that means that, you have to have a formal proceeding before you are executed or jailed or have property confiscated from you. That's what this means. That's what it means. It's a procedural norm. And then there's the phrase about equal protection under the law. Well, that was understood at the time of the ratification of the 14th Amendment. That did not mean, it didn't even go so far as to mean that blacks and whites had to sit at the same lunch counter. It did not mean that. It didn't mean they had to go to the same schools. Now, I'm not saying it's desirable for blacks and whites to go to separate schools. My point is that the people who drafted that amendment certainly did not think it required that, given that the same people who drafted that amendment voted to segregate schools in the District of Columbia. So they meant this to have a very narrow scope. What they intended it to apply to was that everyone should have the power, unhampered by the state governments, of being able to enter into contracts, including labor contracts, freely, to own and enjoy the use of property, and to sue in the courts. That these were considered to be the absolute bare minimum essential rights so as to prevent the freed slaves from slipping back into a form of slavery. Well, this was basically what one of the early Civil Rights Acts was intended to do. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, I think. And that did not pass constitutional muster. So the idea then was the 14th Amendment will in effect codify these particular things and put into the Constitution so that then we can protect these things. So the thinking would be, this is Mel Bradford's interpretation. M.E. Bradford's a great constitutional scholar. And Bradford, his book chapter on the 14th Amendment is called Changed Only a Little, and I forget what the subtitle is. And what he's arguing is that the Constitution was changed only a little by the 14th Amendment, in that in these particular areas, we are imposing additional restrictions on the freedom of the states to act. They can't deprive people of these certain things. But apart from that, the system remains as before. So that was the understanding. I think there is ample evidence that this was the understanding. We're codifying a Civil Rights Act and putting it into the Constitution. That was what it was intended to do. It was not intended to be a vehicle of ongoing revolution, a kind of an ideological revolution dedicated to implementing equality of outcome and all this. This would have been considered crazy by everybody who was involved. So anyway, that's the best I can do in a short span.
So it seems like, it oversees the 10th one, which is kind of says, the state doesn't have as much power because you got this one here saying, I should be equal to.
Well, what it is saying is that in these particular cases, in suing and in contracts and in property ownership, then the federal government can in fact override what the states are doing. But then in the ensuing years, with the so-called slaughterhouse cases in the 1870s, clearly the courts were interpreting the 14th Amendment very narrowly. And then later it was said that the 14th Amendment then applies the whole Bill of Rights against the states, which, again, the evidence does not seem to bear this out, because in the 1870s, the so-called Blaine Amendment was attempted to be passed. The Blaine Amendment, in effect, did that. The Blaine Amendment said that the federal government can enforce the First Amendment on the states. Well, if the 14th Amendment already did that, then why would you need the Blaine Amendment? So I think a lot of this is just, if you give these people this much, they will take a mile. If you think, well, we've got the best of intentions, we'll just allow the federal government just a little bit more power, because surely it'll be exercised for only good reasons. And then, as time goes on, the 14th Amendment became a crowbar by which the federal government pries its way into everything.